Briar Hill City, a Friday evening. The all-in-room restaurant was silent. Amid half-finished silverware clinks and the watchful stares of the city's elite, a 10-year-old boy, leg in a brace, rose slowly from his chair and extended his hand to a black waitress just as the soft notes of a piano began to play. Would she lower her gaze and decline, or would she change both of their lives with a single dance? Before we begin this story, please like the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful, heart-touching stories just like this one. Briar Hill City, 7:04 p.m. Under the warm amber glow of the all-in room, the city's most exclusive restaurant, the gentle clinking of glasses, the hush of cutlery gliding over porcelain, all came to a sudden halt. Time paused, stretching longer than a single breath. At the center aisle, between two rows of elegantly set tables, stood Eli Whitmore, age 10. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and steel braces around both legs, his small frame trembled slightly. He looked up, eyes wide, hopeful, and lifted his right hand toward someone no one expected. Standing in front of him was Naomi Carter, the only black waitress on staff at the all-in room. She still had a tray of wine glasses mid-delivery. Sweat marked the collar of her white uniform, the echo of a 10-hour shift. Eli said nothing, but the hand he extended, trembling, sincere, was inviting Naomi to dance. The music continued softly from the grand piano in the corner, a quiet, meandering jazz tune. And in that moment, the entire restaurant, filled with the wealthiest, most powerful, most immaculately dressed figures in all of Briar Hill, froze beneath a question no one dared speak aloud. Will she dare touch Jackson Whitmore's son? At the VIP table near the back, Jackson Whitmore, the wealthiest man in the city, watched intently. His face showed no anger, but also no clear permission. A single approving nod could grant Naomi safety. A single furrow of the brow could end her future. But Naomi didn't ask for permission. She didn't retreat. She simply looked at the boy and saw something in his eyes no adult seemed to carry anymore: unconditional trust. No one moved, no one picked up their forks, and Naomi, in her white apron, soft-soled shoes, and a heart pounding hard against her ribs, stood on the edge of a decision that would define everything: to obey the order of hierarchy, or to answer the call of a child's heart. Naomi Carter drew in a deep breath. She didn't look toward Jackson Whitmore's table. Instead, she gently lowered her tray of untouched wine glasses onto the nearest table. Then, quietly, deliberately, she undid the ties of her white server's apron. No apology, no permission, no explanation, only a single act. She reached for Eli's small hand, the hand that had been waiting in silence. "You're asking me to dance?" she whispered, her voice so soft it felt like the rest of the room didn't exist. "Then I can't very well do it, while still dressed as your waitress." A murmur rippled across the restaurant. Chairs shifted, heads turned. A middle-aged woman leaned into her husband and hissed, "She's lost her mind. With someone like Whitmore, one wrong move, and she'll never work in Manhattan again." But Eli smiled, a small, tentative smile, but real. He turned, still holding Naomi's hand. One step, screech. The sound of Eli's leg braces scraped sharply against the marble floor, slicing through the silence like a razor. No one said a word. No one stepped in. No one stopped them, not out of agreement, but because no one dared. From across the room, Gavin Cross, the restaurant manager, clenched his hand so tightly The wine glass nearly shattered. He looked to Jackson Whitmore for instruction. But Jackson said nothing. He just sat still, gaze locked on his son, as if seeing something he'd long forgotten. Naomi walked in rhythm with Eli, step for step, uneven, dragging, hesitant. But she didn't correct him. She didn't lead him. She let him lead. And that was the moment everyone in the room realized. Power doesn't always come from the loudest voice. Sometimes it comes from the quietest step, finally being heard. Naomi and Eli moved between the tables as if the world outside no longer existed. No blaring music, no spotlight. Only the soft scrape of Eli's leg braces on marble, and the breath of diners who had forgotten how to chew or speak. A woman near the window whispered, "Is this even a dance?" Naomi didn't answer. She simply tilted her body ever so slightly, adjusting her pace so Eli wouldn't feel out of step. He didn't lead well. He didn't know when to turn, where to stop. Each step staggered, off rhythm. But Naomi let him lead anyway. And that was what made the room tremble. Respect isn't born from perfection. It's born when someone is willing to let a child take the lead, even if it's only for 3 crooked steps. At the far end of the room, Jackson Whitmore rose from his seat. The entire restaurant froze, expecting him to shout, to order the music cut off, to fire Naomi on the spot. But he stood still, his hand clenched tight by his side, his face expressionless. But his eyes were storming. A memory crashed through. Elizabeth, his wife, gone. Laughing, spinning with Eli in their old living room, a worn-out record crackling on the player. "He doesn't need to dance right," she once said. "He just needs to be allowed to move, in his own way." Naomi didn't know that. But on the final step, when Eli looked up with a trembling smile, she bowed deeply. Not like a server, but like a dancer to her partner. "Thank you for the invitation," she said, voice formal. "It was an honor." No one clapped, but no one dared look away. She walked slowly back toward the kitchen, leaving behind a dance that shattered prejudice with nothing more than quiet dignity. Dinner continued in awkward silence. The faint clinking of cutlery returned, sparse, cautious, as if everyone were pretending what had just happened was some kind of technical glitch. But Eli didn't return to his plate. The boy kept his eyes on the kitchen doors where Naomi had vanished. He didn't understand why no one applauded. He didn't understand why his father, the man who always said, "Be confident," was the first to retreat when he stood up. He turned to Jackson and asked quietly, "Why did you do that, Dad?" The question wasn't loud, but it was enough to wrinkle the face of the most powerful man at the table. No one had ever asked Jackson Whitmore that. Not even in boardrooms, where he was always the one asking questions, never the one answering. He glanced at his son, then looked away, lifting his wine glass, the same way he always did when dodging anything too human. But this time, his hand trembled. It had been 2 years since the accident, 2 years of paying millions for specialists, treatments, and cutting-edge therapies. 2 years, and not once had he taken Eli out to dinner in public. And on this very first night, instead of watching his son be welcomed, he had been the first to tell him to sit down. Eli didn't cry, but the way the boy looked at him, it was like holding up a mirror, one that reflected the thing Jackson had never been brave enough to face. The fear of failing as a father. Jackson lowered his head, set the glass down slowly, and for the rest of the meal, he said nothing. Only one question hung in the air, unanswered dash. Unspoken dash, because no one had the courage to answer it. Why does something as simple as a dance feel threatening to an entire room. The next morning, Whitmore Plaza gleamed under the rising sun, steel and glass, reflecting power, control, and the illusion of permanence. Naomi Carter stood at the ground floor reception desk in a worn charcoal dress suit, scuffed heels, and a handbag held together by black thread. "I have a 10 a.m. appointment with Mr. Jackson Whitmore." The receptionist glanced at her, head to toe, with the kind of scan that felt more algorithm than human, then picked up the phone. "18th floor, Ms. Lena Brooks will escort you." The elevator doors closed behind Naomi. Surrounded by glass and mirrored steel, she saw herself reflected, not as the waitress from last night, not as the founder of Freedom Steps, but simply as a black woman walking alone into a system that had rejected her 3 times before. On the 18th floor, Lena Brooks was already waiting, her polished smile as cold and smooth as brushed metal. "Follow me." The corridor stretched like a runway, every surface gleaming, bouncing back Naomi's footsteps like they didn't belong. Lena didn't lead her straight in. She turned into a waiting lounge, stopped, and looked at Naomi sideways. "Has he fired you yet?" Naomi blinked, not at the question itself, but the way it was asked, like it was policy, not possibility. "Excuse me. People like you step out of line, draw attention." Lena shrugged. "Usually means the job's gone. Things like that happen fast around here." Naomi smiled faintly, not because she was offended, but because she was used to it. "And what exactly do you think my role should be?" Lena paused, adjusted her glasses. "Small, quiet, and grateful, to be allowed in the elevator." Naomi didn't reply, but when the meeting room door clicked open and Lena ushered her into Jackson Whitmore's office, Naomi's gaze didn't lower, not for a second. Because today she wasn't here for forgiveness. She was here to offer him something else entirely. The opportunity to understand his own son. Jackson Whitmore's office was vast, more like a concert hall than a workspace. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan sprawled beneath him like a conquered empire. But Naomi Carter didn't look at the city. She looked at the man standing with his back to her, hands in his pockets, the morning light casting over his shoulders like a cloak of power, or the last armor he still wore. "Have a seat," Jackson said, still facing the window. Naomi sat. The chair was soft, swiveling, but cold. He turned, no smile, no polite gaze, just a stare, not to connect, but to assess. "I didn't call you in because of last night," he said. "I called you because I want to understand why Eli chose you." Naomi didn't answer immediately. She knew this game, the expensive silence, meant to make you fill the space with words you didn't plan to give. Instead, she asked, calm but firm, "Do you ask that question of your therapists too?" Jackson paused. "They have files, degrees, and I have results." The air grew heavier by a half degree. "What did you study?" he asked. "Bachelor's in Child Development, NYU. I was midway through a master's in special education." "Why didn't you finish?" "My younger sister was diagnosed with mild neurodivergence. I left school to become her primary caregiver." Jackson opened a drawer and pulled out a slim file folder. "I know, I looked you up last night. Naomi Carter, co-founder of a program called Everlight Motion." She nodded. "Rejected 3 times for funding by your own philanthropic board." Jackson turned the page. His face didn't change, but his breath slowed, just a little. "You knew who I was when I walked into the all-in room. From the moment you stepped through the door, and I still said yes to Eli." A long pause. This time he didn't look at her like an employee. He looked like a man who wasn't sure what or whom to believe anymore. I've hired the best, top specialists, private therapists. Naomi gave the slightest nod, then said evenly, but none of them ever let Eli lead. The sentence sliced through the layers of control he wore like armor. Jackson sat back, gripping the arms of his chair. In a room once used to evaluate, to command, to sign the termination papers of people like her, Naomi Carter now stood as the one asking questions he had no answer for. Jackson Whitmore sat with his arms crossed, his voice deeper now, but still cloaked in the practiced calm of a man used to being immovable. "How much do you want?" Naomi didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, as if she hadn't heard him right. "I'm asking how much it would take for you to become Eli's full-time companion. Around the clock, I'll pay 5 times your current salary, private insurance, car service, whatever you need." She let out a soft laugh, not mocking, just tired. "You think I came here because I needed money?" Jackson said nothing. Naomi rose from her chair. "You're mistaken, Mr. Whitmore. I don't need another job, and Eli doesn't need another care package." Jackson's brow lifted slightly, just enough to reveal something he rarely let anyone see. A flicker of wounded pride. Rejection, something power had never trained him to accept. Naomi reached into her bag and placed a small flyer on his glass desk. The design was simple, a hand-drawn logo, pale but steady lines. Everlight Motion Project. "We hold a class every Tuesday, 4 p.m., first sessions free." "Is this therapy?" Jackson asked, genuinely confused. "Number, it's a space where kids get to be human. And if you do show up, don't bring a business card. Bring your ears and your eyes." She turned to leave. A few steps later, she paused at the door, still not looking back. "I'm declining your offer. Not because I don't need the opportunity, but because Eli needs someone who doesn't see him as a project to be fixed. He needs someone brave enough to follow." The door closed behind her, quietly. But to Jackson, that sound cracked like thunder inside the cathedral of his ego. For the first time in a boardroom as silent as a chapel, he couldn't buy what he wanted. Not with wealth, not with influence, not with control. Only with one thing he hadn't mastered: the courage to step out from the shadow of his own power. If he dared. Tuesday afternoon. The late sun angled through the windows of South Haven Community Center. Hand-drawn posters hung crookedly on the walls. At the base of the stairwell, a chalkboard sign read, "Everlight Motion Project, 4 p.m. dance class, no registration needed." Naomi Carter wiped the sweat from her brow, rolled out a worn dance mat, and adjusted the frayed strap of her old speaker. Everything in this room was cheap, but none of it was cheaper than the resolve she and her sister Kayla poured into every session. She didn't know if Jackson Whitmore would show up. She wasn't waiting for him, because she didn't need a donor. She needed a witness. 4:07 p.m. The center's front door creaked open. A boy stepped in first, his left foot slightly faster than the right, the brace on his leg clicking softly against the floor. His eyes lit up at the room bathed in warm light and soft background music. It was Eli. Behind him came a tall man, slightly awkward in his movements. A pale grey sweater far too crisp. Brown loafers uncreased, clearly trying to look casual, but every line of his body betrayed the class he couldn't shed. Jackson Whitmore, Kayla Carter, pinning a flyer to the corkboard, glanced over and whispered under her breath, "That's him. The guy who tossed our grant application 3 times." Naomi nodded. eyes never leaving Eli, who was slowly making his way toward the group of kids. "People like him don't walk into places like this," Kayla muttered. Naomi didn't turn around. She whispered, just loud enough, "Don't underestimate a father when it's his own son leading the way." Eli sat beside a little girl fixing the wheels on her chair. They didn't speak. They just smiled. Together. In the back of the room, Jackson stood motionless. And somehow, the man who once shook the foundations of global finance felt smaller than ever inside a 300-square-foot studio. No LED tickers, no PR advisors, no power left to grip, just the eyes of his son, watching him as if to say, "I've found the place where I get to be led. What about you?" And in that moment, for the first time since the accident, Jackson felt fear. Not fear of losing influence, but fear that what his son needed most wasn't what he could do. It was what he could let go of. There was no bell to mark the beginning, no rows of spectators, only a worn wooden floor, and children with non-standard bodies, and hearts that didn't wait for permission to dance. Naomi Carter knelt beside Eli, crouching down to meet his eyes. "What do you feel like doing today?" Eli looked around. A boy was practicing hopping on one leg. A girl spun her wheelchair like a ballerina. No one was perfect, but no one needed to be. "I want to dance," Eli whispered. "My way." Naomi nodded. "Then don't ask for permission." She stood up and stepped back, not just physically but symbolically, far enough for Eli to feel independent, yet close enough for him to know, if he stumbled, she'd be there in a heartbeat. Eli took a deep breath. He gently pivoted, using his stronger left leg for momentum. His right, wrapped in a silver brace, couldn't lift high, but it held his balance. One step, slow, but his own. He turned, lifted his shoulder, smiled softly. Music began to hum from the small speaker in the corner, a mellow jazz tune. No applause, no corrections, just movement. In the back corner, Jackson Whitmore stood frozen, unblinking. Not because the dance was flawless, but because for the first time in 2 years, he saw his son move without fear. Not out of obligation, not to please anyone, but to lead himself. Kayla stepped up beside Jackson and handed him a folding chair. He didn't sit. "Not used to watching your son look fragile?" she asked, half teasing, half daring. Jackson responded quietly, slowly, I just realized. He's never been fragile. I just never gave him the chance to prove he wasn't." Across the small room, the soft dragging of a leg brace echoed once more. Not as a flaw, but as the rhythm of a boy reclaiming his own body, in a way no textbook ever taught. Jackson remained still by the wall when the back door quietly opened. A tall, older woman stepped in, her posture straight, her silver hair neatly pinned behind her head. She wore a light grey overcoat and carried a walking cane, though her gaze showed no trace of frailty. Dr. Vivian Holloway. Jackson turned, startled. "You—" She gave a small nod, her lips curving into a smile, one that could have been wistful or just faintly amused. "We meet again, Mr. Whitmore. In a place you once denied funding 3 times for being impractical." Jackson said nothing. Naomi stepped forward, standing between them, her eyes steady, unwavering. "You didn't believe in our science back then. That's all right. Today, Eli is living proof. No paperwork required, just your eyes." Dr. Holloway handed him a thin report, just a few pages. "We're tracking neural remapping through autonomous motion. No mandates, no templates, just giving children the chance to reorient their own sense of self. Jackson flipped a page. Neuron diagrams, brainwave charts, handwritten notes by Naomi. He froze when he saw one line underlined in blue ink. Reclaiming self-perception through the power of choice. Naomi added, her voice calm and firm, "We don't teach children how to step. We teach them that they have the right to choose which steps belong to them." Eli, meanwhile, was now laughing with a girl in a wheelchair. No instructions, no counting beats, only laughter floating in the air with the soft music. Jackson looked at his son, not as a broken child needing to be fixed, but as a whole being redefining his own limits. He slowly closed the report. "You were right from the beginning, Naomi. I can hire the best team of doctors, but I can't buy that moment." Naomi didn't smile, but something in her gaze softened, like armor finally lowered after years of wear. "No one can, Mr. Whitmore. That's what makes it priceless." The music softened. In a moment seemingly made for silent glances, Eli Whitmore, the boy who hadn't dared take a step alone since the accident, slowly rose in the center of the studio. He unstrapped one side of his leg brace. No one stopped him. No one warned him. Naomi turned slightly, ready to step in. But Dr. Holloway gently shook her head. "Let him choose." The children in the room instinctively stepped back, forming a quiet circle. Eli took a step. Slow, unsteady, slightly tilted. But a step entirely his own. No one held him. No one guided him. He chose to lift his foot, lower it, and place weight on muscles long forgotten. From the far end of the room, Jackson Whitmore stood frozen, as if all the air had left the space around him. He watched his son, no longer the fragile boy in rehabilitation photos, but a child conquering a fear larger than any billion-dollar negotiation. Eli turned, wobbling slightly, then laughed. The room erupted. Naomi didn't rush to hug him, she simply clapped once firmly. "You just made your first step, Eli, and it was yours." Eli looked at his father, eyes shimmering. Jackson raised a hand to his face, but it was too late. A single tear had already fallen. Not from pain, not from shame, but because for the first time in 2 years, he understood the one thing all his power could never buy was this moment. Less than 2 hours after Eli's first step, the moment had already exploded across social media. Billionaire Jackson Whitmore's son takes his first steps. No doctors, no trainers, only one guide, Naomi Carter. At the main entrance of the Everlight Motion project, the scene was chaos. Camera flashes fired like lightning. Reporters jostled for position. Microphones pointed squarely at him. "Mr. Whitmore, is it true that Whitmore Capital rejected this program 3 times? Do you believe that decision may have delayed your son's recovery? How do you explain that it wasn't a medical expert, but a waitress, who helped your son walk for the first time?" No aides, no prepared statements. Jackson Whitmore, the man who once rocked global stock markets with a single nod, now stood alone, encircled by questions. If he stayed silent, they'd say he dismissed Naomi's role. If he defended himself, it would only expose how long he had refused to listen. Inside the center, Eli was still laughing with other kids, unaware that outside his father's legacy was being weighed second by second. Jackson drew a long breath. His eyes landed on a large poster near the doorway. "Freedom doesn't come from a perfect step, but from the first one you choose to take." He turned to the cameras. "I was wrong." Silence fell. Whitmore Capital rejected this program 3 times, not for any strategic reason, just because I didn't believe in something I didn't understand. Today, I'm not here as a benefactor. I'm here as a father, grateful that my son was guided not by a specialist, but by someone who saw what I never did, the strength that was already inside him. The flashes burst again. I'm announcing today, Whitmore Capital will fund the Everlight Motion project for a minimum of 5 years. Our first commitment, establishing a permanent rehabilitation center named the Holloway Center. A reporter called out, "And will you retain operational control, Mr. Whitmore?" Jackson paused, then shook his head. He turned his gaze toward Naomi, still quietly cleaning the practice mats alongside a group of kids. "My only condition, Naomi Carter retains full leadership over this program. No interference, no negotiation." That sentence struck harder than any contract Jackson had ever signed. Because this wasn't about buying redemption. It was about giving power to the one who never needed it to prove she belonged. 3 months after the headline-making announcement, at the construction site of the new rehabilitation center, the Holloway Center, Jackson Whitmore sat beside Naomi Carter. No tie, no assistant. Just him holding a draft blueprint designed by Naomi and Dr. Holloway. Naomi glanced sideways, half teasing, eyes still fixed on the plans. "I thought you'd hand all this over to your engineering team." Jackson's voice was quieter now, more grounded. "I used to think that throwing money at something was enough. But this time, I don't want to control. I want to understand." Across the site, Eli was helping a little girl take her first steps, gently encouraging her with the same words Naomi once told him, "You don't have to walk right. Just walk your way." Naomi looked over at Jackson. "You hear that? That's leadership, but not the kind you used to teach." Jackson nodded, eyes still on his son. "I used to think being a father meant standing in front, showing the way. Now I realize, sometimes being a father means stepping far enough behind, so your child dares to step forward. No applause, no ceremony, just 2 people who once stood on opposite sides, now facing the same future. A future not built on legacy, but on learning how to walk side by side." A few minutes later, Jackson stood, brushed dust from his jacket and said, "Looks like I'll need to read up on motor neurons if I want to keep up with all this. You think you could lend me a few books?" Naomi smiled, gently but with weight. "I'll send you a list, but don't expect summaries. Here, everyone starts from page 1. And Jackson nodded. He didn't argue. For the first time, he was truly learning to follow. Inside the main training hall of the Holloway Center, Eli Whitmore, now wearing only a lightweight brace on one leg, was leading a small group of 3 younger children as they moved to soft, rhythmic music. No coach, no clinical supervisors, only the quiet, watchful presence of Naomi Carter in the corner of the room, and the respectful silence of adults who had once been trained to intervene. She didn't correct their steps. She didn't command, "Stand straight," or "Keep the beat." She simply asked one by one, "How do you feel like moving today?" Eli knelt to assist a little girl using a gait trainer. "It doesn't have to be fast. It just has to be real. Slow is still dancing." Naomi turned and caught Jackson's gaze from the observation gallery above. In the eyes of a man once wired to measure outcomes, there was now only light, the kind that comes when a father realizes he's being taught by his own son. He walked quietly down the steps, stood beside Naomi, and said softly, "He doesn't need me to hold him up anymore." Naomi looked at Eli, now standing tall in front of the group, laughter ringing like chimes through the room. She nodded. Number, but he still needs you there, not to guide, but to witness. Jackson fell silent. For years he had paid for everything, doctors, devices, therapies, but never realized that his presence was the one thing his son had longed for most. At this center, children weren't learning to walk the right way. They were learning that any step done their way deserves to be seen. And Eli, once the silent boy in the wheeled chair, was now leading others toward finding the rhythm of their own. On the day of the Holloway Center's grand opening, sunlight poured through the glass wall engraved with hundreds of names, children who had once been part of the Everlight Motion project. Each name was a milestone, a leap, a steady stance, a moment of courage. Eli Whitmore stepped onto the main stage. No one escorted him. There was no loud announcement. He simply smiled, bowed to the audience, and motioned for 3 younger children to join him, taking a few simple steps together. Unrehearsed, unforced, free. The hall erupted in applause. But amid the ovation, many noticed Jackson Whitmore standing behind the stage. Without his usual grandeur, without the commanding suit, without a polished speech. Just a father, standing still, watching. Naomi Carter approached. Jackson turned to her and for the first time spoke honestly. I used to think a center like this was charity. Today I realize it's the apology I never had the words to give my son. Naomi didn't reply, because sometimes true remorse doesn't need forgiveness. It needs continuity. A reporter pushed forward, asking loudly, Mr. Whitmore, what changed your entire view of your son and this project? Jackson looked toward Eli, who was now helping a little girl adjust her steps. I used to think leadership meant going first, but Eli taught me the bravest thing you can do is step back and let someone else show you a better way. He paused, then turned to the crowd, his voice steady. And I hereby announce, as of today, Whitmore Capital will sponsor the Holloway Center nationwide. But on one condition, Naomi Carter will always hold the key. No one has the right to dim a light born from silence and turned into movement. Naomi turned away, not out of modesty, but because she knew this story wasn't ending, it was just beginning. With a dance, a step, and a father who had finally learned how to follow, not everyone gets a second chance. And not everyone has the courage to admit, I was wrong. But sometimes, all it takes is one imperfect step, one unforced hand, and someone brave enough to follow instead of lead, for the world to quietly tilt back toward what's right. Naomi Carter didn't prevail because she was stronger. She prevailed because she never forgot why she started. Eli Whitmore didn't heal because of a miracle. He healed because someone gave him the right to lead. And Jackson Whitmore didn't change because of pressure. He changed the moment he understood. Power doesn't make us great. It only makes it easier to get lost if we never learn to pause. If you've ever believed in something and lost faith, if you've ever been hurt for being too kind, then maybe this story was meant to remind you, don't extinguish your light just because the world isn't warm enough yet. Hold on to that small piece of gentleness. Because who knows, at the end of one trembling step, a whole world might be waiting to change.